Montana Territory, June 1878. The wind rolled dust through the main street of Red Elk like it carried a warning. Travis Zane swung off his horse outside the Painted Mare Saloon, boots hitting dry earth hard. His hat was pulled low, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd gathered around the front porch. It was not a usual crowd. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, faces eager, greedy. He caught sight of the sign nailed above the saloon doors: auction tonight. Girls. Clean. Quiet. Travis's jaw tightened. He had ridden into Red Elk for a sack of oats and to check if the telegraph office had news from his sister in Wyoming. What he found instead was something he could not walk away from. A loud voice called out from the saloon steps, "This next one's real special, boys. She don't talk, don't make a fuss. Pretty as a picture." The crowd shifted and Travis saw her. She stood on the wooden porch, shoulders stiff, hands clasped in front of her. Young woman, maybe 20. She wore a loose pale dress that hung like it belonged to someone else. Her dark brown hair was braided tight, the end tied with a fraying ribbon. Her eyes were clear, large, but distant, like she had left herself somewhere safer. "She mute," someone called. "Yup," the auctioneer replied. "Not a peep out of her. Makes her easier to handle." A man in a dusty gray coat raised a hand. $20. $25, another barked. Travis stepped forward. $50. The crowd went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. "You sure?" $50, Travis said again. "Cash." He pulled bills from his coat pocket and handed them over before anyone could challenge him. The auctioneer looked disappointed but counted the money. "She's yours," he muttered. Travis didn't look at the men still standing there, their faces red with disappointment. He walked up the steps, took off his coat, and held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him. "You do not have to go back in there," he said softly. "Not ever." She reached out and took the coat with slow, careful fingers. Her hands trembled. She draped it around herself, and the moment his coat covered her, her shoulders dropped slightly, like she could breathe again. "I am Travis," he said. "Travis Zane." She looked at him, then nodded once. They left the saloon without a word. He helped her onto his horse and climbed up behind her. They rode out of Red Elk, leaving the Painted Mare and its crowd of filthy souls behind. The sun was low by the time they reached his cabin by the creek, tucked in a stand of cottonwoods. He helped her down, opened the cabin door, and stepped aside. "It is not much," he said, "but it is safe." She walked in slowly, her eyes scanning the small space with stove, table, 2 chairs, bed tucked in the corner, a second cot folded against the wall. He watched her. She did not speak, but every movement was careful, measured, like she was still waiting for something to strike. "I will take the cot," he said. "You can have the bed." She turned, eyes wide. Then she shook her head. "It is all right," he said. "You need rest." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once more. He lit the lantern, set water to boil, and laid out bread, dried meat, and apples. She sat at the table and ate slowly, never meeting his eyes. Afterward, he laid the cot out near the door and let her take the bed. She sat on the edge of it, wrapped in his coat. Travis stood by the door, unsure if he should say more. Finally, he just said, "Good night." She looked up and gave a small nod. He lay down, arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the creak outside and the occasional shift of her in the bed. He did not know her name, but he knew he had done the right thing. The next morning, he woke to the smell of wood smoke and bread warming on the stove. She stood at the counter, hair braided again, sleeves rolled up. She glanced over when he stirred, then placed a plate on the table. He sat down. "Thank you." She looked down, then reached for the notepad he had left by the stove. She wrote something and held it out. "My name is Selene." He read it, then looked at her. "That is a good name." She smiled just a little. It hit him harder than he expected. Days passed. She stayed. She never spoke, but her silence was never empty. She moved with purpose. She cleaned, cooked, helped gather firewood, and even learned to saddle his second horse. At night, they sat by the fire. She liked to draw. He had bought her pencils and a stack of paper from town. She would sketch by the hearth while he read or whittled. Sometimes she would show him what she drew: a bird, a tree, once a picture of the cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and two small figures sitting outside. One night, he caught her watching him. Her eyes held something quiet but strong. "You all right?" he asked. She reached for her notepad and wrote, "I feel safe." He swallowed hard. "Good. That is all I want." She looked at him a long time. Then she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him on her own. He did not move, just let her hold it, warm fingers wrapped around his. From then on, that hand seemed to find his more often. When they walked to the creek, when they sat on the porch at night, she never needed to speak. Her silence told him everything. One afternoon, they rode into town together. She wore a dress he had bought from a widow who did mending, and her hair was loose for the first time. People stared, but Travis kept his hand on her back. They stopped at the general store, and Selene picked out fabric, buttons, and thread. She smiled when she looked at him, and he could not help but smile back. "You sure you are happy out there with me?" he asked as they loaded supplies. She wrote on her notepad, "I have never been happier." Back at the cabin that night, they sat outside, the stars wide above them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. "I might not know everything that happened to you," he said, "but I want to give you a life that feels like yours. Not one someone forced on you." She turned her face to his, eyes full. Then she kissed him. Soft, sure. It was the first sound she made, just a breath against his lips. And in that moment, he understood. Her silence was not a wound. It was strength. It was trust. It was love. And he loved her back. Fiercely. Quietly. Completely. She never needed to say the words. He felt them every time she looked at him like that. By mid-July, the river narrowed with heat and the cottonwoods lost their bloom. The cabin stood quiet but not empty. Selene had taken to mending beside the open window where a breeze could catch her hair and stir it across her cheek. Travis noticed she no longer startled at every creak of the porch or shadow across the wall. One morning, he found her waiting by the doorway with 2 saddlebags packed and her coat folded over one arm. She held out a piece of paper. "I want to see the world outside your land." He studied her face. "A ride, then?" She nodded once. They crossed the ridge beyond the creek and followed a trail that dipped through pine and aspen. The air smelled of sap and distant smoke. Selene rode ahead sometimes, standing in the stirrups when the path narrowed, her braid lifting behind her with the wind. She didn't look back, but Travis kept pace, letting her choose the road. Near dusk, they reached an abandoned homestead, long gone to weather and moss. A broken wheelbarrow lay tipped beside a collapsed barn. Selene dismounted and walked the quiet yard, her fingers brushing the outline of old fence posts, her eyes moving over the bones of what had been a life. Travis stood beside the well and watched her kneel to gather a rusted horseshoe half buried in the dirt. She cleaned it with the edge of her sleeve, then tucked it into her bag. "You collect things that feel like pieces of something?" he asked. She met his gaze, then pointed to the horseshoe, then to her chest. "Pieces of yourself?" She nodded. They camped beneath a bluff of red stone. Travis set the fire low, and they ate quietly, the sky turning violet above them. Selene reached into her bag, pulled out a folded piece of cloth, and handed it to him. Inside was a square of embroidery, 2 horses, a cabin between them, and a small figure at the door. He ran a thumb over the stitches. "You made this?" She nodded. "When?" She took a coal from the fire, drew a crescent in the dirt, then tapped it twice. 2 moons ago," he said. "That's when I first saw you in Red Elk." She met his eyes, and this time she didn't look away. He turned the cloth over in his hands. "You already knew you'd stay." She didn't answer, but the curve of her mouth was soft, sure. As night settled, they lay beneath their blankets, the fire low between them. Travis watched stars form through the trees, and the silence stretched long and warm. He turned toward her. "You ever think about tomorrow?" She blinked slowly, then rolled to face him. The firelight caught her expression, not fear, not yearning, but steadiness. What would your tomorrow look like? If it could be anything? She reached for his hand, pressed his palm flat, then traced a circle over it with her fingertip. Then she placed her own hand inside his and left it there. He closed his fingers around hers. You want your life here. With me. She didn't move. I want that too, he said, voice low. The next morning, they rode east along the river, following it until they reached a small trading post. A wagon stood out front, half loaded with crates of flour and salt. A man with a tobacco-stained beard emerged from the store and nodded at Travis. Still need that window glass? He asked. I do, Travis said. And a bolt of blue cotton if you've got it. Selene walked to the edge of the porch where a girl no older than 10 sat with a sketchbook on her lap. The child looked up and offered the pencil. Selene knelt, took it, and drew a single wildflower in the corner of the page before handing it back. The girl grinned. You don't talk. Selene shook her head. That's okay, the girl said. Mama says quiet people hear better. Selene's smile was small but true. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden bird she had carved weeks ago during a storm. She held it out. For me? The girl asked. Selene nodded. Travis watched from the wagon, the glass panes wrapped in wool beside him. When she turned back to him, something had shifted in her face like a root had settled deeper into the earth. That night, back at the cabin, he fitted the new glass into the window frame while she made tea. The air smelled of pine smoke and wild mint. When he finished, she handed him a cup and stood beside him, watching the last orange light pass through the clear pane. Feels different, doesn't it? He said. She touched the glass, then looked at him. Like we're not just fixing things. Like we're building something. She stepped closer, set her cup down, and took his hand. He didn't speak again, just leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the trees outside. Inside, the silence held no distance. Only promise. The first frost came quiet, like a breath across the meadow. Travis stood at the barn fence in the early light, arms crossed, watching Selene scatter grain for the hens. She moved slow, thoughtful in her rhythm, not out of caution anymore, but care. Her boots left narrow prints in the dusted grass, and her wool shawl hung loose around her shoulders. He'd never known how much could be said without sound. The way she tilted her head when she wanted to understand more. The small lift of one shoulder when she was teasing him. The way her gaze lingered on him longer each evening, like she was learning how to trust happiness. Later that morning, he found her perched on the ladder, reaching for the top shelf where he kept the carving tools. She held one in her hand when she turned toward him. You want to try? He asked. She held the blade up, then pointed to the cedar plank leaning against the wall. He set it on the workbench. You'll want to go with the grain. I'll show you on this edge, then you take over. She watched closely, then took the tool, her grip neat and sure. Her first cut wavered, but she didn't stop. By mid-afternoon, she had shaped a curve from the wood that resembled a river bend. He traced it with his thumb. You've got a steady hand. She glanced at him, then touched the corner of his mouth with her finger, lightly, and tilted her head. He laughed. All right, I'll admit it. I'm proud. She smiled without looking away and returned to her carving. That evening, Travis brought in a sack of dried beans from the shed. Selene had already set 2 plates on the table and folded a scrap of cloth into a square between them. A small sprig of pine rested on top. He looked at it, then at her. You made us a table setting. She motioned to the pine, then to the window. For the season? She nodded once. You got a way of noticing things most folks pass by. She moved behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek to his back. He stood still, one hand resting over hers. The room was warm, the kind of warm that came from more than fire. After supper, she brought out a bundle wrapped in flour cloth. Inside was a shirt she'd sewn coarse cotton dyed the color of deep river stone. She held it up, then looked to him. For me, she nodded, then tapped her chest. You made it yourself. Her smile reached her eyes. He stepped close, brushed a strand of hair from her brow. You keep giving me pieces of a life I didn't know I was missing. She rested her hand on his chest, right over his heart, and left it there. The next day, they rode south to a neighbor's homestead. Eli and Ruth Hadley had sent word they were butchering hogs and needed help. Travis hadn't planned on bringing Selene, but she'd saddled her mare before he even finished tying his boots. As soon as they arrived, Ruth pulled Selene into the kitchen and put a knife in her hand. Travis worked with Eli splitting wood and salting pork. The sun dropped behind the ridge before they finished, and Ruth insisted they stay and eat. At the table, Ruth leaned close and whispered, "She's clever. Didn't need a word to tell me how I like my biscuits folded." Travis smiled. "She's got a way about her." Back at the cabin, after the fire was settled and their coats hung by the door, Selene brought out a sheet of paper. She drew the Hadleys' table, every face set around it, each with a small mark, freckles, a crooked nose, a braid looped too tight. Then she added a line along the bottom, a border of leaves. Travis pointed to it. "That's their tablecloth." She nodded. "You remembered all that." She tapped her temple, then her chest. "Mind and heart," he said. "That's how you hold the world." She reached for his hand, slid her fingers between his. Her grip was firm, not tentative like it had been once. He met her eyes. "I want to make you a promise." She waited. "I'll never speak for you, but I'll make sure you're heard." She brought his hand to her lips and kissed the back of it, soft and certain. That night, as they lay beneath the quilt she'd stitched from scraps of old shirts and traded cloth, she turned toward him and placed her palm against his cheek. Her eyes searched his face, not for permission, she already had that, but for truth. He leaned in, lips brushing her, slow, reverent. Outside, the wind shifted through the pines. Inside, nothing needed saying. It was already understood. By early November, the valley turned steel gray in the mornings, and the frost clung longer to the grass. Selene had begun wearing the wool shawl he'd traded for in Miles City, the one with the stitched edge in faded red. She'd taken to rising before first light, pulling water from the well while the stars still held. Travis found her on the porch that morning, oiling the hinges of the door with bare fat she'd rendered herself. She worked slowly, careful not to waste a drop, sleeves rolled to the elbows of a new flannel shirt she'd sewn from scrap. He stood beside her, watching the way her brow furrowed in concentration. "You ever done that before?" he asked. She shook her head, then pointed toward the latch, then to herself. "You taught yourself just from watching?" She nodded once, then handed him the tin cup of fat. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, and she bumped his shoulder with hers, laughing without a sound. After breakfast, they packed the wagon with a crate of root vegetables and 2 cured hams wrapped in canvas. The Hadleys had sent word that the schoolteacher, Miss Ellen, had taken ill, and the community was gathering supplies to help her through the winter. Selene filled a small basket with the dried rosehips she'd collected last month, and tucked a strip of linen with her own stitching inside. The road to the Hadley homestead ran along a ridgeline where the wind held teeth. Travis drove the team while Selene sat beside him, her hands wrapped in the mittens he'd lined with rabbit fur. She didn't speak, but she hummed sometimes now, under her breath, a low, steady tune she only made when she thought he wasn't listening. At the Hadleys, Ruth met them with a shawl around her waist and a baby on her hip. She hugged Selene one-armed and ushered them inside. The parlor smelled of linseed and ash, and a kettle steamed on the stove. "I heard tell someone's been carving out there," Eli said as he stepped in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Selene pulled a wrapped bundle from the crate and handed it to him. Inside was a figure of a rooster, all detail and balance, tail feathers flared. "Well, ain't this something?" Eli murmured. "You got hands like a clockmaker." Selene dipped her chin, then gestured to the mantel, asking without asking. "Go on. He'll look fine up there." As she crossed the room, Ruth leaned toward Travis. "She's different now." "So am I," he said. Ruth nodded. "You both look like you've been walking toward the same thing a long time and finally reached it." That evening, back at the cabin, Travis lit the lantern while Selene settled near the stove, rubbing warmth into her hands. He pulled a folded sheet of brown paper from his coat and set it on the table. "Got this from the mercantile last week. Thought you might want it." She stood, crossed to the table, and unfolded it. It was a catalog page thread, ink, bolts of fabric, a hand loom, and near the bottom a small foot-pedaled press. "I figured you might want something more permanent than charcoal and pencils," he said. "You could make prints. Bind your own books." She traced the image of the press, then looked at him. "It ain't cheap," he added. "But we've got coin put away. If you want it, we can start saving proper." She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed to the shelf where she kept her drawings, pulled down a folded piece of parchment, and opened it to reveal a sketch he hadn't seen. 2 chairs beside a hearth, a press in the corner, paper stacked neatly. The window showed snow falling beyond. "You already saw it," he said. She stepped close, slid her hand into his, and held it there. He tipped his head toward her. "We've got a good life. You've made it good." She pressed her forehead to his chest, and for a long time they stood that way, the only sound the soft pop of the stove and the wind outside. Later, as they lay beneath the quilt, he watched her eyes in the firelight. "I ever tell you I used to think I'd end up alone?" he asked. She shook her head. "I didn't mind it. Figured it was easier that way. But now I know better." She reached for his hand, placed it against her collarbone, then covered it with her own. "You brought the quiet with you," he said, "but it never felt empty, just honest." She drew his palm to her lips, kissed it once, then held it there. Outside, snow began to fall, soft as breath. Inside, the stillness was full. The snow had deepened by mid-December, lying thick over the roof and softening every edge of the world beyond the cabin. On the coldest mornings, ice feathered the inside of the window panes before the fire took hold. Travis rose early, often before the first rustle from Selene's side of the bed. He liked the quiet of those first minutes, liked to watch her sleep, hair undone and one arm folded under her cheek. That morning, he found her already sitting cross-legged on the floor near the hearth. Pages of her drawings spread around her in careful arcs. Some he recognized, others were new, the slope of the hill behind the cabin drawn as if from memory. A sketch of Ruth's baby sleeping in a cradle, the curve of a hand over another. "You thinking about binding them?" he asked, crouching beside her. She looked up, then tapped one of the newer pages, a sketch of the press from the catalog, but drawn as if it already sat in the corner of their cabin. Then she pointed to the pages around her and pressed her palms together like a book being closed. "Seems to me," he said, "you've already made your mind up." She tilted her head, then reached behind the woodpile and brought out a wrapped bundle. When he peeled back the cloth, he found a hand-stitched ledger, cover made from dyed canvas, corners reinforced with scrap leather. Inside were copies of her drawings, pressed carefully and stitched in place. "You did all this?" She nodded and began signing the first page with a carved wooden stamp he hadn't seen before, her initials, S and Z, inside a circle. He turned the book in his hands. "You've made yourself an imprint." She rested a hand on his knee, fingers warm through the wool of his trousers. He covered it with his own, then looked at her. "You want me to write to the supplier, don't you?" She nodded once. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "We'll get the press. And when it comes, we'll make space for it. Move the table, maybe add another shelf." She leaned in, pressing her lips to his temple. Her hands slid around his neck, and he let himself pull her close, their foreheads resting together. The warmth between them had grown steady, like coals that never fully cooled. Later that day, with the sky pale and clear, they walked out to the far edge of the land where the fence posts had begun to tilt with the frost. Travis carried a hammer and a small bundle of iron stakes. Selene held a coil of twine and a piece of slate scratched with measurements. "You figured the spacing yourself?" he asked. She nodded, then handed him the slate. He scanned it, mouth tugging into a slow grin. "You want to mark out a garden?" She dropped the twine and began driving a stake into the frozen ground with the heel of her boot. He stepped back. "You always planning ahead." She raised one eyebrow. "Not complaining," he said. "You think of things I wouldn't." They worked without speaking, stomping snow flat and stringing the twine until a rough rectangle stood outlined in the field. Selene stepped into it, looked around, then turned to him with both arms lifted slightly as if to say, "There. See? I see it," he said. "Come spring, we'll have rows running north to south. Good light." She smiled, then bent to draw a line in the snow, marking out where the beans might go. The next week, the catalog order arrived by freight wagon, bundled in straw and tied with waxed rope. Travis lifted the press into the cabin while Selene cleared a space near the back wall. She touched the polished metal with reverence, running her fingers along the flywheel. "You'll need ink," he said. "And paper stock. I can ride back in the next few days." She walked to the shelf, pulled down a small box, and opened it to reveal several wrapped bottles and 2 bundles of linen paper. He blinked. "You beat me to it." She shrugged, then grinned. That night, they sat by the window, the press gleaming in the corner. Snow drifted past the glass in slow spirals. Selene leaned against his side, head tucked beneath his jaw. "I never expected you," he said softly. "But now I can't imagine waking up without you next to me." She looked up at him, her hand trailing over the buttons of his shirt, then rested on his chest. "You don't need to say anything," he murmured. "I know." She drew his hand to her face, kissed the palm, then pressed it to her cheek. In the weeks that followed, they fell into new rhythms. She carved and printed, stitched and pressed. He fixed the roof, chopped wood, and read aloud from the small stack of books they'd traded for. Every evening ended with her curled against him, the scent of pine and ink clinging to her skin. By the end of February, her first bound book was finished. She set it in his hands without ceremony. The cover bore her initials and a single pressed wildflower between layers of waxed linen. He opened it slowly, page by page. "These are the days we've made," he said. She nodded, then pointed to the last page, a sketch of 2 figures beneath a tree. Their hands joined, a home behind them, smoke rising from the chimney. "I've never known peace like this," he said. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never lose it." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a ring, simple iron, the inside carved with a faint symbol he recognized as her mark. His breath caught. "For me." She slid it onto his finger, then touched her own hand where a second ring, smaller but matching, already rested. "I didn't ask," he said, voice thick. "But I would have. I wanted to." She leaned forward, kissed him slow, her hands framing his face. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. Years passed. The garden grew. The press turned often. Her books began appearing in trading posts as far as Helena and Bozeman. Folks started calling her the mute artist of the Stillwater Hills, though anyone who'd met her knew she didn't need a voice to be heard. They built a second room on the cabin the following spring and filled it with shelves, canvas, paper, and light. Children from neighboring farms came to learn drawing from her. She taught them with nods and gestures, a raised eyebrow, and the occasional encouraging squeeze on the shoulder. Travis taught them how to plant rows, fix fences, and read the sky for weather. He never tired of watching her teach. They grew old together in the same steady way they had loved, without rush, without noise, one day folding into the next like pages in a well-bound book. And on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, he would still wake sometimes to find her hand curled in his, her breath soft and sure beside him. Nothing had been promised at the start, but everything had been kept.